Imagine the summer of 1984. The professional basketball landscape was standing on the edge of a global revolution, waiting for a spark that would change the game forever. The air was thick with anticipation, and every franchise was hunting for a savior. We all know the legends born from that legendary summer, players who would go on to build empires and redefine greatness on the hardwood. But among these towering titans stood another name, a colossal talent who was promised the exact same glory. His name was Mel Turpin. He had the size, the skill, and the undeniable presence of a future champion. Yet, while his peers ascended to basketball royalty, the story of Mel Turpin took a radically different path, plunging into the dark side of fame. How does a player with such astronomical potential simply vanish from the spotlight? According to the official archives of the Professional Basketball League, on June 19, 1984, the landscape of sports shifted dramatically during the draft ceremony. That specific date is etched in history as the dawn of a new era. But why did that evening become the beginning of the inevitable fall for Mel Turpin? The draft transcripts from that night reveal that Mel Turpin was selected as the 6th overall pick. Being chosen 6th in the most famous draft ever is a monumental achievement, a statistical guarantee of a deafening success and a lucrative professional journey. When a franchise invests that heavily in a prospect, they expect a cornerstone for their future. This documented fact makes his rapid decline even more baffling. If the numbers on the scouting reports were so incredibly high, what actually went wrong? In the reports of sports journalists from that time, it was frequently noted that the expectations placed on the top picks were crushing. Was the pressure too immense, or were there unseen forces already pulling him down before he even stepped onto the court? The cameras flashed, the crowd roared, and Mel Turpin smiled warmly, completely unaware of the looming shadows. Little did anyone know, right as the nationwide television broadcast aired on June 19th, behind closed doors, executives were quietly finalizing a transaction that would become the very first devastating blow to his professional journey. The spotlight was still burning bright, and the ink on the ceremonial documents was barely dry when the first betrayal occurred. Mel Turpin believed he was heading to the nation's capital, ready to dominate the paint for the Washington franchise. But the harsh reality of the business hit him before he even had a chance to pack his bags. According to the broadcast recordings and the internal reports of the team managers from that evening, he was instantaneously traded for another player, Cliff Robinson. This was not a gradual parting of ways. It was a ruthless, immediate transaction. Why would a team spend the highly coveted 6th overall pick on a towering giant only to discard him moments later? In the archives of the major local newspapers, particularly the sports columns published the very next morning, reporters described the move as a shocking pivot. The press speculated wildly about the hidden motives of the front office. Was there something in the medical evaluations, or was it purely a financial maneuver? For Mel Turpin, the psychological impact was immediate. He was reduced to a bargaining chip, stripped of the triumphant welcome most top selections receive. In the public case files of his career trajectory, this specific night is often pointed out as the moment his confidence sustained its first major fracture. He was now headed to Cleveland, a city with its own set of demanding expectations and a rebuilding roster. The trade fundamentally altered the trajectory of Mel Turpin. Instead of joining a team that actively chose him, he was sent to an organization that merely acquired his rights. In the interviews conducted with sports analysts decades later, it was noted that this lack of initial foundation made everything that followed significantly harder. He was expected to perform like a savior for a front office that had just gambled on his potential. But the true danger was hiding in the fine print of his new agreement. As Mel Turpin arrived in his new city during the late summer, a specific clause was quietly inserted into his paperwork, a clause threatening him with financial penalties amounting to tens of thousands of dollars if he failed to meet a certain physical standard. To understand the magnitude of the expectations placed on Mel Turpin, one must rewind the clock to his collegiate years. Before the trades and the controversies, he was an absolute force of nature playing for the University of Kentucky. The fans adored him, and opponents feared him. On the court, he formed a devastating partnership with Sam Bowie, creating a front-court duo that seemed entirely unstoppable. According to the official press releases of the university from that era, Mel Turpin was honored with the prestigious All-American status. This was not a subjective opinion. It was a formally recognized fact that solidified his position among the elite amateur athletes in the country. The statistics from the Collegiate archives paint a picture of sheer dominance. During the 1983 to 1984 season, Mel Turpin recorded an astonishingly high shooting percentage, consistently hovering above 60% from the field. In the historical records of the athletic department, it was stated that his touch around the rim was unusually soft for a man of his massive stature. But behind the deafening success and the glowing headlines, there were subtle whispers. While the crowds cheered his offensive displays, scouts were quietly noting his struggles with endurance and discipline. Did the university coaching staff protect him from the harsh realities of professional conditioning? Or did they simply ignore the warning signs to keep winning games? In the memoirs of rival coaches, it was often mentioned that if you could make Mel Turpin run the floor continuously, his effectiveness would plummet drastically. The warning signs were always there, masked by his sheer talent and the overwhelming support of the collegiate system. But the professional league is a merciless environment that exposes every single flaw. As the spring of 1984 approached, the glowing evaluations were secretly accompanied by reservations. In the confidential scouting reports circulated among the general managers just weeks before the draft, there was one deeply alarming figure regarding his physical conditioning, a number that the team executives desperately tried to keep hidden from the relentless sports media. The transition from the amateur ranks to the unforgiving professional arena requires a level of physical conditioning that few can fully comprehend. When Mel Turpin arrived at the training camp in Cleveland, the stark contrast between his undeniable raw talent and his physical state immediately set off alarm bells. According to the internal medical evaluations conducted by the franchise in the late summer of 1984, the newly drafted center reported to the facility weighing well over 280 pounds. This single figure, quietly buried in the physical assessment files, became the first major red flag for an organization that had just bet their entire future on his broad shoulders. The coaching staff expected a nimble, explosive giant ready to run the floor, but instead, they were met with a young man visibly struggling to keep pace during standard transitional drills. In the published memoirs and subsequent interviews of the Cleveland coaching personnel, it was repeatedly emphasized that managing his diet quickly became a daily, exhausting battle. They tried everything from strictly monitored meal plans to grueling extra conditioning sessions, but the numbers on the scale simply refused to cooperate. The situation escalated rapidly, transforming from a private fitness concern into a heavily scrutinized organizational crisis that spilled into the locker room. The management grew increasingly frustrated, realizing that their highly touted rookie was not physically equipped to handle the brutal 82-game schedule of the professional league. They needed a way to force compliance, a strategy to make the player understand the absolute severity of his condition. To combat this growing issue, the front office resorted to extreme measures that hit right at his bank account. They instituted a rigid weigh-in protocol, establishing a system where every extra pound carried a staggering cost, a clause that would end up draining tens of thousands of dollars from his pockets in a matter of months. If the internal struggles within the team facility were difficult, the public humiliation was absolutely unbearable. The sports media landscape of the 1980s operated without a filter, showing virtually no mercy to athletes who failed to instantly live up to their billing. Instead of analyzing his tactical adjustments or acknowledging his genuine efforts to adapt to a new city, journalists chose the easiest and most painful target: his physique. In the heavily circulated pages of Sports Illustrated magazine during that rookie campaign, writers began prominently referring to him using a mocking moniker that would haunt his legacy forever: Dinner Bell Mel. This nickname was not just a passing locker room joke. It became a relentless brand of public ridicule. According to the archived transcripts of major sports broadcasting networks from that era, television commentators would openly laugh about his eating habits while the games were being broadcasted live to millions of homes. The arenas were even worse. Opposing fans would bring snacks to the front rows, waving them and taunting him mercilessly as he ran up and down the court. Mel Turpin, a young man suddenly thrust into the blinding national spotlight, absorbed all of this public toxicity in silence. He rarely fired back at the reporters, choosing instead to retreat further into himself as the psychological weight compounded the physical one. He was expected to be a fearless gladiator, but he was being treated as a comedic sideshow attraction. Behind the facade of these incredibly cruel jokes, a much darker reality was quietly unfolding away from the flashing cameras. The relentless criticism regarding his weight masked a deeper physiological issue that no one in the press box could possibly understand. The true source of his struggles was not merely a lack of willpower, but an actual medical condition, the first undeniable signs of which surfaced in the confidential reports of the team physician late in December of 1985. Despite the relentless mockery and the exhausting internal battles over his conditioning, it is crucial to remember exactly why Mel Turpin was drafted 6th overall ahead of future Hall of Famers. When the noise faded and he found his rhythm, the giant was truly a magnificent force to be reckoned with. He possessed an offensive skill set that was remarkably polished for a man of his immense size. He had a silky smooth jump shot, a delicate touch around the rim, and a natural instinct for scoring that simply could not be taught by any coach. There were nights when he looked every bit like the unstoppable superstar Cleveland had originally envisioned. In the official game logs of the league, one particular night stands out as the ultimate proof of his raw talent. A game where he dominated the paint and poured in a staggering 35 points against formidable opposition. Furthermore, according to the statistical tracking reports, during the month of February in 1986, he strung together a series of performances that temporarily silenced even his harshest critics in the media. During this peak stretch, he demonstrated a level of offensive efficiency that rivaled the absolute best centers in the entire league. These flashes of absolute brilliance left fans and analysts alike incredibly frustrated, wondering why this dominant version of Mel could not show up every single night. These spectacular outings proved that his talent was never a myth. The ability was always there, buried underneath the immense pressure and the physical limitations. For a brief period, it seemed as though he had finally turned a corner and figured out how to survive and thrive in the professional ranks. He was producing solid numbers, and the whispers of a massive career revival began to circulate throughout the league. However, this promising momentum was abruptly shattered by a devastating phone call from the general manager's office in the late summer of 1987, a conversation that permanently severed his ties to Cleveland. The phone call that ended his tenure in Cleveland was not a polite negotiation. It was a sudden, one-way ticket out of town. According to the official transaction registries of the professional league, in December of 1987, Mel Turpin was traded to the Utah franchise. For a player already struggling with his confidence and maintaining his physical conditioning, this destination was the absolute worst possible fit. Utah was aggressively building a rigid, unforgiving offensive system constructed entirely around the legendary pick-and-roll duo of Karl Malone and John Stockton. There was absolutely no room in that locker room for an unpredictable center who needed the basketball in his hands to find a comfortable rhythm. In the season logs published by the league, the data paints a devastating picture of his rapidly declining influence. His playing time plummeted drastically, averaging merely 12 minutes per contest during his stint with the team. The coaching staff demanded intense defensive discipline and relentless running, two specific areas where Mel was fundamentally lacking at that stage of his career. In the post-game interviews broadcasted on local television stations, the sheer frustration in his voice was impossible to hide. He was no longer the focal point of an offense or a promising prospect. He was an expensive, marginalized backup sitting quietly on the far end of the bench. As the long winter dragged on, his professional isolation deepened. He watched as other players from that famous draft class signed massive financial extensions, while he fought simply to get onto the court during the final minutes of blowout games. The internal reports circulating among the coaching staff described a player who had completely checked out mentally, unable to adapt to the secondary role forced upon him by a demanding head coach. The tension finally reached a boiling point behind closed doors. Following a heavily debated private conversation with the front office in the spring of 1988, Mel made a shocking decision that completely stunned the sports media, choosing to pack his bags and flee the country entirely. Walking away from the premier basketball league in the world is a dramatic decision very few professional athletes ever make voluntarily. Yet, desperately seeking a fresh start and an escape from a highly toxic environment, Mel crossed the Atlantic Ocean. According to the European sports registries, for the 1988 to 1989 season, he signed a highly publicized agreement with a club located in Zaragoza, Spain. This unexpected move was initially framed by his representatives as a triumphant rebirth. Far away from the mocking journalists and the rigid professional coaches, he was instantly treated like an absolute superstar once again. The Spanish sporting newspapers from that autumn reported extensively on his arrival, noting his massive frame and undeniable scoring touch around the basket. The financial terms, as detailed in various international contracts analyzed by reporters at the time, promised him hundreds of thousands of dollars to be the undisputed face of the franchise. For a brief period, this geographic strategy seemed to work perfectly. The European game was slightly slower, relying much more on half-court execution, which suited his specific offensive skill set wonderfully. He was scoring heavily, dominating the paint, and smiling for the international cameras once more. However, moving across the globe rarely solves deeply rooted internal issues. The cultural isolation and the lack of top-tier medical monitoring soon allowed his old habits to resurface with a vengeance. He was thousands of miles away from home, playing in unfamiliar arenas that held only a fraction of the spectators he was accustomed to entertaining. The Spanish fairy tale ended just as abruptly as it began. By the time the season wrapped up, investigative journalists looking into his personal affairs uncovered a massive discrepancy in his bank documents, a devastating financial hole that left him absolutely desperate and begging for one final opportunity back in the United States. The Professional Basketball League rarely offers second chances to players who walk away on their own terms, especially those carrying a heavy reputation for a questionable work ethic. But against all logical odds, a final door opened exactly where his turbulent journey had originally begun. Public statements released by the Washington franchise confirmed the signing of a veteran minimum contract, bringing Mel back to the nation's capital for the 1989 to 1990 season. This move was heavily promoted as the ultimate redemption story, a matured veteran returning to his roots to prove every single doubter wrong. Unfortunately, the romantic media narrative completely ignored his harsh physical reality. The league had evolved rapidly during his brief absence, becoming noticeably faster and far more athletic across every single position. According to the official archives of the league, during that grueling final campaign, Mel managed to appear in 59 games, but his impact on the court was barely noticeable. Observers sitting courtside frequently noted in their columns that he was constantly laboring up and down the floor, his joints visibly struggling to support the extra weight he continued to carry. The delicate shooting touch that once made him a premier collegiate star was completely overshadowed by his sheer inability to keep up with the relentless pace of the modern game. The press box, once filled with eager reporters analyzing his every move and criticizing his conditioning, barely paid attention to his struggles anymore. He had transformed from a highly scrutinized lottery pick into an invisible afterthought, quietly playing out the final guaranteed dollars of his contract. There was no explosive scandal, no dramatic press conference, and no farewell tour to mark the end of his playing days. Instead, on a quiet evening in the spring of 1990, the Giant simply walked off the hardwood for the very last time, stepping out of the glaring spotlight and plunging headfirst into a brutal 15-year era of complete public oblivion. When the final buzzer sounds and the arena lights go dark, professional athletes face a terrifying new reality. For a player like Mel Turpin, the transition from the glamorous lifestyle of a highly paid athlete to a regular citizen was incredibly harsh and remarkably fast. During the 1980s, the league did not offer the comprehensive financial literacy seminars or the robust psychological support programs that modern players enjoy today. According to the retrospective evaluations conducted by financial sports analysts, his total career earnings were estimated to be somewhere around $2 million. In that era, this was considered a massive fortune, a sum that should have comfortably secured his future and the future of his family for several decades. However, the luxurious lifestyle, poor investments, and a complete lack of proper financial guidance caused those bank accounts to drain at an alarming rate. Furthermore, based on the established union rules from the early 1990s, players with such relatively short careers were not entitled to the massive, lifelong pension payouts that veterans rely on today. According to the public financial records and reports from that specific decade, the safety net he so desperately needed simply did not exist. He was left completely on his own to navigate a world that only valued him when he was putting a basketball through a hoop. The money evaporated much faster than anyone could have ever predicted, forcing him entirely out of his comfortable retirement. It is a classic, tragic tale of a professional athlete losing everything, but the sheer speed of his financial collapse remains truly startling. He went from flying on private charters and staying in luxury hotels to counting every single penny just to keep the lights on in his home. And if you think those initial $2 million were somehow enough to cushion the blow, just wait until you uncover the shocking occupational documents from the early 2000s, revealing exactly what the former superstar had to do just to survive. The transition from a celebrated collegiate champion to a regular blue-collar worker is a psychological drop that very few can truly survive with their pride intact. Desperate for a steady paycheck to cover his mounting daily expenses, Mel Turpin was forced to completely abandon his basketball legacy and enter the ordinary workforce. According to the verified reports published by local journalists in his home state of Kentucky, the former 6th overall draft pick took a job working as a standard security guard at a commercial facility in Lexington. He traded his brightly colored jerseys and the roaring applause of 20,000 fans for a plain uniform and the deafening silence of long, monotonous shifts standing by a door. The emotional toll of this new reality was absolutely crushing. In a rare and deeply personal interview granted to a local newspaper during those years, Mel admitted that the absolute hardest part of his day was dealing with sudden bursts of recognition. People passing through the facility would inevitably stop, stare at his massive frame, and ask if he was the famous basketball player they used to watch on national television. Having to constantly explain his current situation to absolute strangers, watching the excitement in their eyes turn into polite pity, was a relentless daily humiliation that slowly chipped away at his spirit. In the investigative reports looking back at his post-career life, colleagues noted that he always tried to remain incredibly polite and professional, masking the deep embarrassment he felt behind a quiet, reserved demeanor. He never complained about the long hours, but the physical strain of standing on concrete floors all day was destroying his already fragile joints. Every single morning, he quietly put on that standard security uniform, desperately trying to hide a rapidly progressing medical condition that would generate astronomical hospital bills by the autumn of 2009. The physical bill for a lifetime of carrying excessive weight eventually comes due, and for Mel Turpin, the medical consequences were severe and entirely unforgiving. The extra pounds that the sports media used to mock so mercilessly during his playing days eventually transformed from a professional hurdle into a life-threatening reality. According to the public statements released by his close relatives years later, the former athlete was battling a highly aggressive and advanced form of diabetes. This was not a mild inconvenience. It was a devastating condition that fundamentally altered every single aspect of his daily existence, bringing constant pain and a terrifying level of uncertainty about his future. He was a man known for his immense strength and towering presence, yet he was quietly deteriorating on the inside. In the official investigative materials compiled much later, a quote from a former colleague at the security company highlighted how rapidly his physical health was declining during his final years on the job. The colleague noted that Mel would often need to sit down due to overwhelming exhaustion, his massive frame visibly struggling to simply walk down the hallway. Despite the clear signs of his suffering, he remained fiercely proud, actively choosing to hide the true severity of his medical struggles from the public eye, and even from his former teammates in the professional league. The financial burden of treating such a complex and aggressive illness without the benefit of a premium athletic healthcare plan was utterly overwhelming. The medications, the specialized treatments, and the constant medical appointments were rapidly draining whatever small wages he managed to earn at his security post. He was trapped in a vicious cycle of physical pain and financial panic, completely isolated from the glamorous world he once inhabited. But exactly in April of 2010, a mysterious new factor was added to his escalating health crisis, a highly concerning detail that the local authorities would later study extensively in their confidential reports. To the outside world, Mel Turpin was still the gentle giant, the man who always had a warm smile and a polite greeting for the locals in his home state of Kentucky. But behind that carefully constructed public facade, a terrifying psychological collapse was quietly unfolding out of sight. When analyzing the emotional state of a former athlete navigating such a profound loss of identity, the absolute silence is often the most alarming symptom. According to the internal records and support logs of the Veteran Players Association, there was exactly zero documented evidence of Mel ever reaching out for professional counseling or participating in any league-sponsored psychological assistance programs during the late 2000s. This documented absence of intervention immediately raises a chilling question. Why would a man struggling with such crushing physical pain and escalating financial burdens deliberately avoid seeking help from the very organization he once represented on national television? In the transcripts of intimate interviews recorded several years later, his former collegiate teammate Kenny Walker offered a heartbreaking insight into this deliberate isolation. According to the published sports reports, Walker stated that Mel was an immensely proud individual, deeply ashamed of how his professional basketball journey had unraveled, and completely unwilling to let his former peers see his vulnerabilities. This specific testimony serves as a crucial piece of evidence, revealing a towering man who consciously chose to suffer entirely alone, rather than admit defeat to his friends. He slowly but systematically withdrew from his established social circles. The once celebrated center was answering his telephone less and less frequently, trapping himself inside a lonely house with his escalating medical bills and the fading, painful memories of his time on the hardwood. The local community simply saw an unassuming security guard going about his daily routine, completely failing to recognize the overwhelming internal darkness that was rapidly consuming him. Neighbors and acquaintances assumed he was simply exhausted from his long, monotonous shifts at the commercial facility. No one sounded the alarm. However, the true, devastating depth of his despair remained entirely hidden from the public eye until the sweltering summer of 2010. His communication simply stopped altogether, leaving a chilling, uninterrupted silence that lasted until the 8th of July, when a frantic emergency call connected to the local police dispatch center, setting off a chain of events that would shock the entire sports world. The blistering heat of July in Kentucky is usually accompanied by the comforting sounds of summer, but on the 8th of July, 2010, the atmosphere in one quiet Lexington neighborhood was violently shattered by the piercing wails of emergency sirens. According to the official police dispatch logs and the timeline established in the initial incident reports, authorities were urgently called to a private residence following a deeply distressing discovery. This was not a routine welfare check. The sheer number of law enforcement vehicles rapidly cordoning off the street indicated that a massive tragedy had unfolded. The address belonged to Mel Turpin. When the first responders breached the perimeter of his home, they were met with a scene that immediately prompted them to secure the area and call for specialized investigative units. The public incident records detailed a grim and chaotic environment. As the yellow police tape went up, the local community stood nervously behind the barricades, whispering and watching as the realization slowly dawned on them that their beloved hometown hero was permanently gone. The towering man who had once brought over 20,000 screaming fans to their feet with his explosive dunks had met a sudden, heartbreaking end in the absolute isolation of his own living room. The detectives meticulously combed through the residence, snapping photographs and carefully bagging personal items, desperately trying to reconstruct the final hours of a life that had spiraled so far out of control. The house was eerily quiet, standing in stark contrast to the roaring arenas he used to dominate. It was during this exhaustive search of the premises that investigators stumbled upon a critical piece of evidence. Tucked away among his personal belongings, they discovered something that definitively closed the door on any questions regarding the immediate cause of his passing, but simultaneously blew the case wide open, leaving the authorities staring at a terrifying new mystery. The rapid swirl of rumors following that tragic afternoon forced the local authorities to step forward and provide absolute clarity to a grieving community and a completely stunned sports world. In the highly publicized case files and the subsequent official press briefings, the Fayette County coroner, a man named Gary Ginn, delivered the solemn final verdict. According to his public medical reports and the official death certificate, the investigation conclusively ruled out any foul play or outside involvement. The 49-year-old former professional athlete had made the devastating, solitary decision to end his own journey. Hearing a medical professional clinically describe the tragic end of a once unstoppable giant was a surreal and heartbreaking experience for anyone who remembered his raw dominance on the basketball court. The detailed coroner's statement systematically dismantled the wild conspiracy theories that had briefly flared up on local radio stations and sports message boards. However, the clinical facts did absolutely nothing to explain the overwhelming psychological pain that led to such a final, irreversible choice. The official documentation provided the precise medical details of what happened, but the true motives remained buried under a mountain of unanswered questions. As the police department began to officially close their active investigation into the physical event, another, much darker narrative began to emerge from the shadows of his private life. While the medical examiner focused strictly on the biological cause of his passing, investigative journalists started digging into the dusty boxes of his personal paperwork left behind in the house. Just days after the official ruling was broadcasted, leaked information regarding a staggering pile of unsent letters and shockingly high numbers on past due medical invoices began circulating, revealing a terrifying financial nightmare that shocked even the most hardened veteran reporters. When investigating the motives behind such a devastating and final resolution, investigators are often left staring at a fractured puzzle. Why would Mel Turpin, a man who was only 49 years old, make the fatal choice to completely end his own journey? As the yellow police tape was taken down, the speculation in the media immediately intensified. According to the financial reports and analyses published by sports economists later that month, one prominent theory pointed directly to a staggering mountain of unpaid medical invoices. The public materials released by investigative reporters highlighted that his aggressive diabetes required treatments costing thousands of dollars out of pocket, a sum he simply could not generate on a security guard's hourly wage. This raises a terrifying question. Was it the sheer panic of financial ruin that finally pushed him over the edge? Another possibility, frequently discussed in the retrospective interviews given by his close acquaintances, focused entirely on his physical deterioration. The daily agony of his condition had reportedly become absolutely unbearable. In the transcribed statements of his former colleagues, it was noted that his joints were failing, and his vision was heavily compromised. How could a man who once defined his entire existence by his absolute physical dominance survive in a body that was rapidly betraying him? He found himself trapped in a silent battle with his own biology, completely isolated from the world that used to celebrate his strength. The official investigators never found a singular, definitive document that neatly explained his internal thought process, leaving the public to endlessly debate these conflicting theories. Was it the crumbling bank accounts, the relentless physical pain, or simply the agonizing weight of living in the dark side of fame long after the applause had completely faded? However, exactly 3 days after these financial versions were published in the local papers, one of the most legendary players drafted in 1984 stepped up to the microphone and delivered a public statement that made the entire professional basketball league absolutely tremble. The sudden and tragic departure of Mel Turpin sent a massive shockwave straight through the heart of the sports world. Players who had completely lost touch with him over the past 15 years were suddenly forced to confront the harsh reality of his silent suffering. According to the official press release issued by the University of Kentucky during the second week of July in 2010, the athletic department expressed profound sorrow, officially recognizing him as one of the greatest athletes to ever wear their uniform. It was a beautiful and highly polished statement, but it immediately sparked a bitter question among the fans. Where was all this institutional support when he was struggling to pay for his basic medications just a few months prior? The national sports broadcasting networks, the very same entities that had mercilessly branded him with cruel nicknames during his rookie campaign, suddenly shifted their tone completely. In the televised interviews recorded in the summer of 2010, legendary figures from his draft class openly expressed their absolute devastation. According to the archived transcripts of these broadcasts, his former peers admitted they had absolutely no idea how desperate his situation had become. They remembered him as the incredibly talented and joyful giant from the 1980s, completely blind to the fact that he was quietly fading away in a standard security uniform. Watching these multi-millionaire superstars shed belated tears on national television created a highly uncomfortable contrast for the viewers. The accolades and the beautiful obituaries were pouring in, but they were tragically late. He was finally receiving the massive public attention he had always craved, but only after making a fatal choice. The television tributes were flawlessly produced, featuring his greatest collegiate highlights and soaring dunks. But while these former colleagues spoke beautiful, rehearsed words into the cameras, behind the closed doors of the league headquarters, a serious and incredibly tense scandal was rapidly brewing over one very specific, uncomfortable question. The heartbreaking conclusion of Mel Turpin's life instantly transformed from a private family tragedy into a massive public indictment of the professional basketball system. Fans and sports columnists began demanding to know who was truly responsible for the ultimate fate of these discarded veterans. According to the historical documents of the Players Association, the union policies during the 1980s were severely lacking in long-term mental health and financial safeguards. The league was generating millions of dollars in television revenue off the backs of these towering athletes, yet offering them virtually zero guidance once their knees gave out and their rookie contracts expired. This undeniable discrepancy quickly became the center of a furious national debate. In the reports compiled by sports sociologists later that year, experts explicitly argued that the entire generation of players from the early 80s was essentially abandoned to fend for themselves. The case of Mel Turpin became the glaring, undeniable proof of a fundamentally broken system. In the publicly available transcripts of the union meetings held after the tragedy, current players began aggressively pushing for immediate reforms, demanding better post-career health insurance and comprehensive psychological counseling for retired members. Was it truly fair to take a young man, hand him immense wealth and unimaginable pressure, and then strip it all away without providing any safety net? The executives found themselves frantically scrambling to control the incredibly damaging narrative. They attempted to frame his situation as an isolated incident, a sad but unique anomaly caused by his own personal decisions. However, the investigative journalists refused to let the issue go quietly. They began digging much deeper into the league archives, looking for similar patterns among other forgotten giants from that specific era. And if you look closely at the medical records of the men who left the league during those years, an absolutely horrifying statistic quickly emerges regarding the average lifespan of former professional centers. When evaluating the devastating conclusion of Mel Turpin's journey, we must also examine the terrifying biological reality of his profession. The human body was simply not designed to carry such massive proportions while performing at an elite athletic level on hard wooden floors for a decade. According to the medical studies published in prominent sports physiology journals during the late 2000s, athletes standing over 7 feet tall experience an exceptionally high rate of severe cardiovascular and joint complications after their playing days conclude. This is not merely a theory. It is a scientifically documented crisis. The constant pounding on their knees, and the massive strain on their hearts create a perfect storm for chronic, debilitating health issues. Mel Turpin stood exactly 6 feet and 11 inches tall. According to the medical profiles from his collegiate and professional days, his massive frame required an enormous amount of physical effort just to maintain basic mobility on the court. Reporters observing the veteran players from his generation frequently noted in their investigative columns that an alarming number of these giants were passing away long before their time, victims of enlarged hearts and rampant diabetes. How could the professional league completely ignore this glaring medical trend? They were actively recruiting these towering young men, exploiting their physical anomalies for massive television ratings, and then abandoning them when their bodies inevitably broke down under the immense stress. The physical cost of entertaining millions of fans was paid entirely in chronic pain and terrifying medical diagnoses. The generation of big men from the 1980s seemed to carry a dark physiological curse, fading away in quiet hospital rooms while the modern league continued to generate billions of dollars. But as we return specifically to the tragic case of Mel Turpin, the focus shifts from his physical health back to the heartbreaking administrative aftermath. The final official closure of his life did not happen in a medical facility, but in a quiet legal office during the autumn of 2010, when his last will and testament was formally read, revealing a financial detail that left everyone completely speechless. The Professional Basketball League may have treated Mel Turpin as a disposable asset, a failed investment quickly swept under the rug, but his homeland viewed him through an entirely different lens. In the state of Kentucky, he was never just a struggling professional player, he was a towering monument to their glorious collegiate history. According to the official archives of the local sports committee, despite his highly publicized struggles on the professional level, he was formally inducted into their Athletic Hall of Fame. This prestigious recognition was not given out of pity. It was a deeply documented testament to the sheer dominance he displayed during his amateur years, a period when he genuinely looked absolutely invincible. In the transcribed interviews broadcasted on local radio stations in the years following his tragedy, devoted fans frequently called in to share their fondest memories of his game. They did not talk about his weight clauses or his minimal playing time in Utah. Instead, they remembered the thundering dunks and the delicate jump shots that brought championship glory to their university. In the reports compiled by journalists documenting his legacy, it was clearly noted that the local community fiercely protected his memory, actively choosing to celebrate his brilliant peak rather than mock his agonizing decline. This deep regional affection created a fascinating duality. To the national media, he was a cautionary tale. To his neighbors, he was a permanent legend. This stark contrast highlights the incredible cruelty of the national sports machine. The same man who was an absolute hero in Lexington was considered a massive disappointment in Cleveland and Washington. But as we look back at the beautiful plaques and the glowing Hall of Fame induction speeches, it is utterly impossible to separate his story from the overwhelming shadow of that one specific summer night. Opening the dusty archives of that legendary draft reveals an incredibly disturbing pattern, a dark trend specifically tied to the exact position where Mel Turpin was selected, proving that the 6th pick carried an invisible, incredibly heavy burden. To fully grasp the magnitude of the tragedy surrounding Mel Turpin, we must return to where this story began. The legendary draft of 1984. That specific evening is universally celebrated as the greatest influx of talent in the history of the sport, a golden moment that minted multiple billionaires and global icons. But every blinding light casts an equally dark shadow. According to the financial records and career earnings published by major economic analysts, the financial disparity between the players selected at the very top of that class and Mel Turpin is absolutely staggering. While the top picks secured lifetime shoe deals and infinite wealth, the man chosen 6th overall was eventually forced to guard a commercial door for a basic hourly wage. How does a lottery system, designed to reward the most talented amateur players on the planet, end up completely breaking a man? In the highly debated segments aired by major sports broadcasting networks, analysts frequently argued that the psychological pressure of being a high draft pick is utterly crushing. In the official transcripts of these sports documentaries, experts noted that if a player drafted in the later rounds fails, they quietly disappear. But if the 6th overall pick stumbles, their failure is permanently broadcasted, analyzed, and mocked on a national scale. Mel Turpin was essentially punished for his high potential. The executives demanded an immediate superstar, and when his physical conditioning faltered, they completely discarded him without a second thought. The story of that famous draft is usually told as a triumphant fairy tale of absolute athletic perfection, a narrative aggressively protected by the league's public relations department. But the tragic trajectory of the 6th pick serves as the ultimate heartbreaking counter-narrative. The league got its global superstars, but it also produced a shattered giant who could not outrun the relentless expectations placed upon his broad shoulders. And as we reach the end of this devastating investigation, there is only one final irrefutable fact remaining in the public record, a single number that forces us to completely reevaluate everything we have discussed today. As the final pages of this investigation turn, the blinding lights of the professional basketball arenas fade away, leaving only the profound silence of a deeply misunderstood life. We have sifted through the official transaction registries, the medical reports, and the heartbreaking quotes from those who shared the hardwood with him. But beneath the staggering statistics, the cruel nicknames published by major sports magazines, and the whispered rumors of financial ruin, there was a human being who simply could not outrun the crushing weight of his own potential. According to the official medical records released by the coroner of Fayette County, Mel Turpin was exactly 49 years old when his journey came to a sudden and tragic halt. 49. That specific number is not just a biological marker. It is a terrifying reminder of how rapidly the window of opportunity closes for those who fall through the cracks of a ruthless entertainment machine. The team executives and the national media built him up as an invincible giant, a cornerstone for a multi-million-dollar franchise, but they completely forgot to protect the young man carrying that massive burden. In the analytical summaries written by sports historians looking back at the 1980s, it is frequently concluded that the true tragedy of Mel Turpin was not his failure to become a global icon, but the league's complete failure to recognize his humanity once he stopped scoring points. His story challenges the carefully curated mythology of the greatest draft class in history. We celebrate the billionaires and the champions from that summer of 1984, but their glittering trophies are forever shadowed by the quiet, desperate struggle of the man chosen 6th overall. The ultimate legacy of this Kentucky legend is not defined by the dollars lost or the games missed, but by the devastating emotional toll of chasing an impossible standard in a brutally unforgiving industry. When you look back at the archival footage of his explosive dunks and his triumphant smile during his collegiate days, you have to ask yourself a deeply uncomfortable question. In a sports culture that demands absolute physical perfection and instant athletic gratification, how many more giants are currently suffering in silence, absolutely terrified to admit they are breaking under the pressure? The numbers on a scoreboard eventually fade away into the dusty archives, but the true cost of the dark side of fame is a heavy debt that can never be fully repaid.